Welcome to the Dragonfly Rising podcast. I am your host, Dr. Tami Dean. Thank you for joining me today as we continue to work together to make a difference. Let's explore how we can use our voice today. Hello, welcome to the Dragonfly Rising podcast. I am your host, Dr. Tami Dean, and I am here with Gabrielle Wallace. How are you?
I am doing well. I'm happy to be here with you.
Awesome. Well, Gabrielle and I had worked together prior to having this conversation today on this podcast, but I really want to give her a chance to kind of introduce herself, talk a little bit about her equity journey and like where she is this today, and then we'll kind of dive into some amazing things that she's doing.
Thank you. So for work by trade, I am an executive coach and I do talent development for educators. I also do work with nonprofit organizations and mobilizing the local community to become their own researchers and validate their research with their own community. There's a lot of history behind that. So keep moving. And I'm also a doctoral candidate at Baylor University studying racial equity in education. And so my journey began when I was a child, honestly, with equity. I come from 3 generations of entrepreneurs, Black entrepreneurs in the South. And so that alone has a lot of history and context to it. And their goal was always to bring quality resources and services to historically marginalized communities. And so I sat in their businesses after school as a little girl, listening to the stories of my community and being poured into by my community. And so that really gave me a lot of cultural wealth, having aspirations, having dreams, just and having the social knowledge of like, how do you navigate this big old world? And so that really pushed me into my undergrad journey in finding a university that was actually dedicated to diversity at the time. And my first day of school, my first orientation was centered around, at that time, it was bigger around tolerance, but also just how do you meet and talk to people from these different backgrounds? Because at the time, it was one of the most diverse schools in the country. And so that led to a lot of interesting journeys in itself, which propelled me into my career as a teacher. And as a teacher, I got to be part of all of these cool different programs, such as like restorative practices and using those things with my students and really taking to it. I was, at the time, I always joke with people that I didn't know they were teaching us at the time to be culturally responsive teachers, but that's what they were teaching us to do. So to me, that was the norm of talking to your students, getting to know them and incorporating all parts of self into the lesson and making sure that it was relatable, because we are talking to students who did not typically have a lot of enrichment outside of school, and making that just as relevant and just as rigorous for them during the school day was important.
Yeah.
And then finally, not finally, but the next part of that journey, I got my master's degree, and my master's program really was big on us talking to leaders. So it wasn't, of course we had papers and things like that, but it was very much so, you go find a leader in education and you interview them and ask them questions about what it's really like to walk in their shoes and the problems that they're really dealing with and the ways that they're trying to address those problems. And so that experience, you would talk to not just the principal, but also like the CFO, right? Or the school psychiatrist. And so I started then to see all the connections between why do we do all of these different parts of school, right? Because sometimes people think we're just teaching, right? And The
Right?
kids come in and we're just teaching. And there's so much when you're dealing with little humans that happens before I can actually teach you, right? I have to make sure you're taken care of. I have to make sure that you have everything that you need. Do you have the skills to communicate what you need? And so there's all these people working with it. And then we have the funding for all of these things. And so that was great preparation for me becoming an administrator and eventually a principal. And my school was a school that was third year improvement required. So for anybody who doesn't know what that means, we essentially had an F rating 3 years in a row. And that's a critical point of meaning the state is in your building and seeing what is happening and why is the school failing. And that was my first experience. And I did not pursue the principalship. I was asked to come and do that work. And so it was a lot to take on. But our superintendent at the time was very big on not letting things go. Because typically, if people don't know, if you have a village, a lot of those enriching learning experiences are taken away.
Yeah.
And so it
Like
becomes
those exciting pieces of the learning, Yeah.
right. The things that kids always ask, well, how am I going to take this to my real life? So the things that really they take it to their real life, which all of it you do, but that they can see that's tangible to them is typically taken away. And so our superintendent was very adamant for us not to do that. We had to continue to have restorative practices, project-based learning before it was popular, blended learning before it was popular,
Mm-hmm.
keeping those extracurricular. And then we would have community members come in every week to talk to our students. Every week they were dealing with the community and taking time to have those experiences. And so by the end of that year, though, we were no longer improvement required. We had raised our scores without lowering the learning experience. And so today, I just really work with others to
Mm-hmm.
do that same work, whether it's in a school or with a nonprofit. And so, and I've really wanted to become a researcher and had the best practices when I was working with others, because a lot of those things I just stumbled through, right? I just
Yeah.
figured them out when I was doing them. They were put on my table and I just figured it out. I didn't really have a solid foundation or learning behind the concepts of what I was doing. So
Right.
it's my journey.
Right. Wow. That's an amazing journey. I want to come back to a couple of things you said. First of all, I feel like the thread and the theme of community, right? Which I think is important to all equity and social justice work, right? Like within the larger community, within the smaller community, within the classroom community, with your professional community. Like it's all about relationship. And you mentioned we're not just teaching, right? And they're little humans. And like this speaks to my heart because I, used to be a professor and all this. I was like, they're just smaller humans. They're humans. So they have feelings, they have emotions, they have life, all these things that are happening to them, just like it happens to us. And the things that we as adults enjoy and want, like autonomy and to be heard and to be seen, so do these young people that we're engaging with in our classroom. So I want to go back because you mentioned your family history, which is so powerful and amazing, and how involved they were with the community and like that organic connection and thinking about that purposeful connection. So I'm not sure what they did, but how did you get into like why a teacher? Like what led you to be like, you know what? I want to do this type of thing that I'm seeing and being a part of as a young person. And I want to take that into the field of education. Like, were they educators or were they not? I'm not sure.
No, I am breaking out of the family business by not being
You're a
from.
pioneer. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, and I actually didn't know per se any educators before I entered the field.
Okay.
Of course I know people along the way, but I didn't have a relationship.
Right.
It was a complete accident. So, but
Hey, that's okay. That's okay.
I like to joke that both my parents are teachers, even though they're by trade, they're in insurance. They do
Hmm.
home and auto insurance. And so did my grandfather. And so but they would teach people things like, for example, 20, 30 years ago in the community that they had set up their business in, certain insurance companies would not come into those neighborhoods to do business
Hmm.
for many reasons. And my mom and my dad were able to get a very good contract, what they call standard insurance. And my mom would teach her customers, like, hey, if you keep your insurance up for 6 months, then you can get this discount. You can qualify for these other things. And so I would watch her really have those conversations with people about the importance of this everyday resource in their lives. And so, but they wouldn't just talk to her or my dad about insurance. They would start to come to my parents about all their life things.
Yes.
So that's how I got to sit there and just kind of sit to the side and listen to that. In my family, the rite of passage is you helping in the business, right? So I was a little change girl. I was passing out change to people to give them the money
Hmm.
back. Yeah. So I got to be the fly on the wall while I was doing those things. But I got specifically into education when I went to college. Because my major was in advertising, but I minored in human development and family studies. And through that, I got to take education courses, and I got almost to the end of my degree, and I said, "Oh my gosh, this is what I want to do with my life." On top of, I was volunteering with children
Hmm.
and becoming a tutor in these days, and I was seeing how some of my students were struggling with reading.
Hmm.
And again, I have that's a whole other podcast on my family history of the struggles with education, but it really struck my heart.
Yes. Hmm. Yes.
And so from there, I talked to a professor and I was like, well, how do I do education policy? Right. And
Mm.
so that was my journey. I do education policy. But I realized when I did my research, a lot of people who make policy decisions about education have never been educators
Yes.
or have no ties to a school system.
Yes. That is, yes. It's still true today. Hmm.
Still true. Still
Still
true.
true.
And so I wanted to be different. I wanted
Yes.
to go through that process. What is it like to be in the schools? And I can tell you, it does make a complete difference because you think because you've been a student that you understand education, and that is not really true, right?
Hmm.
It's almost as meticulous to me as the medical field, right?
Absolutely.
But unfortunately, you know, you can have a nurse. A nurse has to know how to do an IV before they walk into, their work setting. However, sometimes today you can have a teacher walk into a classroom and they haven't had any exposure to just those foundational practices to walk in. And so I think we're seeing a lot of that today. And but to me, that's not on the teacher, right? That's on the institutions that are supposed to prepare a teacher and the institutions that are supposed to be not just evaluating a teacher, but supporting them.
Mhm.
And so that's also how I got into focusing on leadership and policy more than everyday practice now.
Yeah. And I would even say how the devaluing that's been happening of
It will.
teacher preparation, right? I have a history. I was in a teacher education professor preparing future teachers, and I've just seen that shift, and we've had a lot of alternative ways for people to become teachers, which is amazing when people, find and discover if that's what they want to do. And also, though, how do we support, coming back to what you said, right? If we do have those people, how do we support and engage and teach them with that background knowledge about what it is really to be a teacher that isn't grounded in their experience, right, of being a student? Because what happens is we just end up recycling oftentimes what are not best practices for engaging students, especially traditionally marginalized students, because, you know, historically speaking, teachers haven't or weren't prepared on how to build that community in that way. So I also think it's really powerful that you had those experiences and you're like, oh, I didn't even realize this. But I think that's something to think about. And I would love people to think about and reflect. Like, I think sometimes people think culture responsive teaching or equity and like it's this big thing or it needs to have this big label or process. And it is, but there's also ways that sometimes you're being taught things. And just because they didn't label it that doesn't mean that's not what you're doing. Right. Like they're looking for this magic. I did X and now I am doing Y, right? Like now I am a culturally responsive educator. Whereas if you listen to your journey, and for those of you that have listened to my journey, right? And even now, it's a process and it's a continual process. Like I'm 25 years in and I still learn from other people and engage with other people. And because that learning just never ends to me. I don't know what do you think? I mean, I feel like you feel that way. Just you don't go in a doctorate program thinking that there's not more to learn and what of research, right? Like they're like, tell me all the things.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I think that's part of my professor. Like, she's like, well, this is your life's work. So let's figure out what we can do right now. And I think that's a good thing for other people too. Like you just said, you think that you're going to arrive to this place and say, okay, I did it, I've done it, but it's life's work, right? Like, I
Huh?
think a lot of us have heard that term in education that if you're an educator, you're a lifelong learner. Well, this
Yes.
is like the intersection of your personal and professional journey. Like you said, you're bringing a lot of those social and skills in, that emotional intelligence in. And so that's the other piece of the work that people kind of shy away from because be a person. Because when you show up for children, you show up, meaning all of you, not just your
Hmm.
best part, right?
Yes.
It means some of those biases, or even if we take out those words, we can say, just think about your family interactions in the home, right?
Mhm.
How do you have conversations? What's the cadence of those conversations? What's the tone of those conversations? What's the why behind those conversations? Those same things are going to show up when you talk to children because children just bring that out, right?
Right.
And their other adults are almost like other little co-parents, right? Like we are talking about our kids in this place. Now, any of the kids that belong to the community, because when they grow up, they are, I'm starting to run into my former students, right? I'm going to get my
Hmm.
registration for the car, and that is my former student
I know. You know,
handling my business.
you know, that is, I think that's a milestone in every educator's journey, right? You run into those you're like, oh my gosh, you were 12 in my classroom, or you were 5, or whatever the age is. Like, wow. It's always so exciting, I think, to run into those students in random, and even to be honest, my college students, right? Like still, mhm. Like it's just that's the humanity of education. And I think that's really important what you said. Like you need to bring your humanity with you, and it's okay to have it. And because we are people, we are educators, but we're also people. So, and that's definitely been a theme we've been exploring or will be exploring in the podcast. It keeps coming up time and time again. So that's super exciting. I'm gonna jump in. I want to jump into your dissertation research, but I do want to laugh and tell you we're like two birds of a feather because my dissertation committee and my chair, and they're like, Tami, you only have to write one dissertation. Like, but I think that's the excitement and the passion around the work. So I feel your passion. That's for me saying, I feel and understand your passion because you're like, let me find out all the things. And like, you have a lifetime to explore all of these things. So your research is very exciting. It's digging in, right, to leadership, how leadership thinks about, engages with a culturally responsive leadership, right? And coming back to that policy, right? And who and how do we have influence on policy? And so it comes back to that voice. So tell me a little bit about what you're exploring and a little bit of the why behind why you decided to explore. I think we've touched a little bit on the why that's led you here, but if there's something we miss, let's talk about that.
Yeah. Well, I think like I'm learning how most people with their dissertation work, we have a student in mind or a student or two that let us here. Um, and for me, it was again after that first year as a principal, I did start to look at the systemic issues, right? But a lot of our work was centered around the adult culture. So let me break it up into two parts. The adult culture of how do we come together as adults,
Mhm.
get on one accord and decide that this is the direction we want to go. And then how do we transfer that onto our students and create change for them, right? And so that ties into my dissertation because I am looking at it from a systemic point of view. Because culturally responsive leadership, it's not new. It's been on the table for a while. I was introduced to it through the work of Dr. Muhammad Khalifa and, of course, lots of other scholars. But that was my first introduction to the work. And so um, the piece of it I wanted to look at, when I was looking at the work, though, was a lot of it was talking about one school or one place. And what we see now is most of our students are now historically marginalized. So my question is, well, if that's most of our students, how do we expand this work if this is the thing that they need, if this is the antidote? And
Mhm.
then we always talking about the institutionalized things we have to fight, right? Or the institutionalized things we have to overcome. And I saw it a lot in the work as a school leader and how crushing that can be. There's also looking at, are we ready? Do we want to take on this work as school leaders, right? 'Cause I can say we should do this all day long, but if people aren't ready, if people don't want to take on the work, then again, that's going to be another crushing experience. And
Mhm.
so it's also about identifying those people. And again, the hopeful outcome of this is that it will create a where we can build that community as leaders that want to take on this work.
Mhm.
Uh, I think that was another part of your question, but that's the initial grade.
No, no, I think you touched on that all. So you have put together a survey that you've sent out to leaders and asking them questions regarding their experience, their thoughts, their reflections, and you're focused in urban areas, right? That correct?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so the focus for urban schools, not to count out rural schools, I've worked in rural settings.
Mhm.
Just statistically alone, though, most of our Black and Brown students, economically disadvantaged students, are heavily populated
Mhm.
areas.
Mm.
And so I just wanted to start there. The word
Yeah.
can't expand, but we're just starting with urban school. And again, the frameworks are coming out of research done in urban schools. So keeping that alignment.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And again, back to the you
Um,
can only write one dissertation.
okay. The survey was created. Again, this was another happy accident.
We love those.
um, my wonderful chair that I've mentioned her several times, her name is Dr. Angela Urick, and she's currently at Baylor University. She walked up to several leaders in this space and asked them, like, hey, is there a quantitative survey for this? I sent emails out and reached out, and so many people said, no, there's not, because this is a largely qualitative field.
Hmm.
And it's very difficult to put together in survey form people's emotions, people's experiences, people in the intersection of all of that, dealing with like race and matters of race, racism, and all the other things. And so, well, I had already committed to it, so I said, I guess I'm going to do it. I'm going to try it.
Right? No, you know what? And that's one of the first things I noticed looking at what you're doing was that it was quantitative, right? And how powerful to have a quantitative tool to like I'm a qualitative researcher at heart, but I do think there is value in bringing together in a mixed method way, right? So how powerful to that you're exploring that with your quantitative survey and your quantitative analysis.
Thank you. And that was the purpose. It was not to say, I know there's a whole thing about ranking it, but that was not the point. The point was, let's paint a picture. Let's paint a whole picture together.
Mhm.
And so my survey is marrying different concepts. It's marrying that culturally responsive leadership with an emphasis on domain one, critical self-reflection, and then taking those and mirroring them to our leadership capacity building models like leadership development, organizational health, which deals with how are we transferring knowledge to other leaders, and then organizational readiness. So is the district ready to support leaders and make this the institutionalized practice over things that have not been asset based? And so it's all based on the school leader self perception. So it's principals, assistant principals, and I've included instructional coaches. We don't have a lot of research right now on the experiences of assistant principals and instructional coaches. And
Mhm.
if you've been in a school setting, you know how vital those roles are to everyday functioning and supporting of the
Absolutely.
teacher.
Absolutely. I'm just thinking about the right, the assistant principal gets left out of all the things, even though they're really like the one who's engaging the most, right, with the ins and outs
Hmm.
of certain components of a school. But then the coaches, right, they have that direct relationship with teachers that has an opportunity to affect the relationship. You know what I mean? That then
Hmm.
trickles down. Like the tone is set, right? So this is where I kind of like this, right? Is the district ready? Is the school ready? Like, are you ready? Like, where is the leadership position to support what's happening in that trickle down to the norm, essentially?
Yeah,
Yeah.
because and that's what it is too, right? Like, this, this is everyday work. That's what
Hmm.
you were speaking on earlier. I need here to say, okay, I have this badge or I have this certification in being a socially responsive leader. This is the everyday work of how, what is our mindset when we show up here, and what are the behaviors that we exhibit and how that align to our values, and not just our values at a school, right? Sometimes what has happened is we have created values as institutions. And I don't think this is just schools. This is just anywhere that's a large organization. We create our own culture and way of functioning as teams. The problem comes when it doesn't intersect or align with the people we serve. And so the people we serve have values. And that's kind of what it goes back to, is that these culturally responsive leaders, before they had a name or a title to them, were people who said, oh, the community is dealing with this equity issue. How can we support them and educate them to deal with that issue? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Or this community may not have wealth in the form, shout out to Dr. Yoso, may not have cultural wealth in, I mean, wealth as far as income, but they have a lot of cultural wealth,
Uh-huh.
meaning they have a loving family, okay? Or they have friends, or they understand how to navigate different social scenarios. They have dreams and aspirations. They have language, more than one, so there's all this richness that makes you up as a person. And a culturally responsive leader sees that not only in the students, but in the teachers and in the community members, and is able to say, I can bring all these people together and honor their experiences.
Yes. And see them as assets rather.
Asset.
Yes. That's the key, I think, is that shift in the view. And you were in that mindset. You wrote something about that critical self-reflection. And I think that's where this goes for leadership, right? You said critical self-reflection is a mindset that drives equitable decisions, while culturally responsive leadership is expressed behavior that brings those out, right? So
Okay.
to me, and tell me if I'm interpreting this wrong, but when I'm self-reflecting and I'm thinking about all the things you shared, right? I'm thinking about the community, I'm thinking about the people under my leadership. How do my actions reflect seeing those as assets?
Yes.
Mhm,
Yes. That's it, Tim.
mhm,
That's it. Yeah.
mhm.
And we say that, right? Like you can say one thing, but what I can see is what I believe sometimes, right? Or a lot of times.
Yes.
But it can be both, right? How
Mhm,
are we talking? How are we talking? What are we moving towards? But what are the behaviors that support that? What are the behaviors that embody that? And so that gets into one of my unpublished studies and surveys, kind of another way I arrived at this place, but I asked school leaders again across different parts of the state and asked them just like what is their experience dealing with matters of race, dealing with racism and social justice in schools. And there was a write-in space in that survey, and they were able to say like they just wanted to be able to have conversations about it,
mhm,
right? And that's part of that critical self-reflection. If we can dialogue, if we can have some mentorship around it, if we can have that conversation, a lot can happen right there in that moment for us. And we carry the outcomes of that conversation into other parts of our lives and other situations when we're at work. But they, at the time, and this was 2021. So, so much happening at that time and coming off the rails of 2020, right?
mhm.
People just didn't feel like they necessarily had the space and the safe space to talk about these issues and how to find solutions, or just what were their initial thoughts and feelings. People haven't had the time to explore what are my thoughts and feelings. I've been told to feel a certain way. I've been told to, or just keep moving regardless of what's happening. But what
Mhm.
do I really think and feel about?
Yeah. That's so powerful, right? What do I really think? What do I really feel? How are we providing the space for those conversations? But and at the same time, I think frameworks for those conversations and support on how to listen to respond
Mm,
versus listen and react.
mm,
Because there's a lot of emotion, right, involved in a lot of this work. There's a lot of feelings and, learning to sit or think or pause in your feelings gives you an opportunity to respond versus react to what's happening or what someone has said or shared about whatever the scenario is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I would say at this level of conversation, it's not about us making a decision about right or wrong,
Mhm.
because we have a lot of rhetoric about right or wrong.
Mm.
But sometimes before we get to that place, before we get to that decision, we just need to say, this is my truth. This is how I'm really feeling. This is what I really believe. This is what I really think. And I just need the space for somebody to allow me to say that to them. And the other person had the chance to say their own thoughts, feelings, and beliefs, right? And so, but that is a very emotional thing. That's a very hard thing because it's a liberating.
Oh,
Brene
yeah.
Brown talks a lot about her shame work, right?
Mhm.
And even Bell Hooks, she has this wonderful quote that I'm going to paraphrase or just take an excerpt from, about how shame is the most powerful tool of our injustices that we're experiencing, right?
Mm.
And those injustices and that shame can paralyze you. They can paralyze you to not speak. They can
Mm.
paralyze you to not think. They can paralyze you to not take action. And so it's very, very, very important that we make space, whether you call it a safe space or a brave space, to just have the initial conversation of
Yes.
processing and reflecting. And if you don't have somebody to do that with, there are the power of written word has changed my life. So taking the time to write it down, to journal it out. And I want to hone in on what she said. There are protocols for how to go about this. This is not something to just jump into.
Mhm. Right.
If we have not practiced, a lot of us were not given those skills.
Mhm.
There are so many protocols for us, and let's follow it, and then we'll develop that over time
Yes.
in natural
Yes.
conversation.
Yes. Over time. I think that's another important aspect. It's not an overnight process, but I love that. I'm so glad you brought in Brene and Bell Hooks, two of my favorite ladies. for for real, they've shaped a lot of my work too. And yeah, shame is powerful and it keeps us silent. Yeah, I don't know what else to say about that, but I just it's time to think about breaking through the silence to get to solution.
I love that too. Like breaking your nuts. That's exactly what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So that got a little heavy there, but that's okay. That's like
Worry not.
I know. No, I love it. I love it. I know you're in the midst of collecting your survey. I know every doctoral student's like, here's my target. Here's my target. That always makes me think of, I don't know, are you a Star Wars fan?
I'm not, but I think I get most of the references.
Okay, so do you remember when Luke Skywalker, and they're trying to, shoot the thing and the Death Star, he's like, stay on target. Do you know what I'm talking about? Okay,
I got you.
that it just popped in my head. That was so random. But anyway, I know you're focused on your target, which is the finishing collecting your responses, which do you have a timeline for that? Just curious, because I'm excited to hear about some of these results that you get. I know you'll have some process to work through that and, finish writing a dissertation and all those things. So where you are in your timeline?
So I have closed the survey and I am currently in the process of, I've got the preliminary results from it. But because this is a survey that I authored and it from scratch, based on different concepts. I'm in the process now of validating it and going to the reliability pieces.
Oh, yeah.
Um, so I'm hoping for to be done and wrapping that up with 30 days.
Woo!
So
That's exciting.
yeah. Like, you always kind of say that with a cringe as a doctoral candidate because you're like, as long as they accept it.
Look, girl, I have, and I still have it saved. I have like final version, final version, the actual final version. I think I have all of those somewhere, something like that, saved from writing my dissertation. So I get it. We're hoping for the 30 days for you. I would love to chat more about results when you have them because I think it's exciting work that's needed. It definitely fits a space in the field that we need. We need to gather information, bring that community together, like you said, because that's how change happens. It happens in our individual choices, but it also happens when we come together as a community to support that change, to support policy change, to, use our voice in a collective way as well as in an individual way. So just thinking about, gosh, we've talked about a lot of things in our time together, which is so exciting. But what would you say, just thinking about tips, for educators, maybe leaders or coaches that are engaging with this work? What would be like your pro tip or something you'd want to share with them?
Yeah. I think for school leaders, a lot of times you are the facilitator of the conversation. Right. And so I would say one, practice that conversation with yourself, that self-reflection and finding that one thing. It could be like, we need to really talk about PLC, or we really need to talk about social emotional learning, or, get a very narrow focus on that thing and that you want to focus on with others in your school, and think about who is the most impacted by this as far as your students and your teachers go, and reflect on where you are in that process and your thoughts and beliefs. But then I'm going to take your word, go and find that protocol that you can have these conversations with the different invested parties around that issue. Meaning, if you're a principal, find a protocol and a space to talk to your leadership team. And don't just say, okay, we want to talk about PLC. No, we want to talk about the identities, this specific identity of student and how we can support them and what are their assets. Let's not only talk about what's not going well, what are their assets? And then how do we teach others to reflect on that during that time, that PLC time? And so that's what I would say. One, reflect yourself. One, find a topic, a narrow topic for you to reflect on yourself. Two, find a protocol to talk to your leadership team about it. And then three, figure out how can you find space and time for others to reflect themselves.
Love that. I love that so much. Well, Gabrielle, I want to thank you for joining me today. It has been a pleasure, as always, to talk with you. I feel like we could talk forever about some of these things,
Yes,
but
ma'am.
that's not a bad thing. I see that as an asset.
It
that
is.
we well, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. I really enjoyed it.
This wraps up another episode of the Dragonfly Rising podcast with me, your host, Dr. Tami Dean. Thank you so much for joining us. And remember that action is always greater than inaction. How will you use your voice today?